If you've ever looked at your midsection and thought, why is this the one place that won't change, no matter what I eat or how hard I try? Or maybe something even more frustrating has happened. You've lost weight in your face, your arms, your legs, but your belly fat stays. Your fasting blood sugar stays high, and it feels like your body just isn't responding anymore. If that sounds familiar, this video is for you. Because today I'm going to show you how visceral fat actually works, why it's so tightly connected to high blood sugar, and most importantly, how to reduce it in a safe, sustainable, science-backed way, often in as little as 4 weeks. And here's the encouraging part most people never hear. Visceral fat is not stubborn fat. When you target it correctly, it's actually one of the most responsive fat in the body. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 4 key methods that work together to melt visceral fat and liver fat, not by starving yourself, not by cutting carbs, but by changing the internal environment that's keeping this fat stuck. Everything I'm sharing is grounded in human studies, metabolic research, and what I see every day working with people reversing insulin resistance. And before we dive in, if you want recipes that support everything I'm about to explain, comment guide below and we'll send you our free meal plans. So first you need to understand what visceral fat actually is. So visceral fat is not the pinchable fat under the skin. It's not the muffin top. Visceral fat sits deep inside the abdomen, wrapped around your liver, your pancreas, and intestines, and metabolically it behaves very differently than the fat you can pinch under the skin. Visceral fat is highly active tissue. It releases inflammatory signals, stress hormones, and fat particles into the bloodstream around the clock. You could think of it like a factory running inside your abdomen, constantly sending out signals that make it harder for insulin to do its job. And insulin's job is to move sugar out of your blood and into your cells. When those signals interfere, sugar gets stuck in the bloodstream and blood sugar stays high. This is why visceral fat is so strongly associated with liver resistance, fatty liver, high fasting blood sugar, elevated triglycerides, and increased cardiovascular risk. And here's a critical detail most people are never told. Visceral fat is far more hormonally active than any other fat tissue. It has a higher density of cortisol receptors and releases inflammatory signals and free fatty acids that directly impair insulin signaling, especially in the liver. That means it responds very strongly to stress hormones, especially overnight, and it directly drives higher morning blood sugar. This is why people with visceral fat often wake up with elevated glucose, even when dinner was perfect. Here's the part almost nobody explains. If you wake up with high blood sugar, it's not because you messed up at dinner, it's not because you ate carbs too late, and it's not because your body randomly forgot how to regulate glucose overnight. It's coming from your liver and what's happening around your liver. Visceral fat is the deep fat that sits inside your abdomen, wrapped around your organs, especially the liver. And this type of fat doesn't just sit there, it actively interferes with how your liver responds to insulin. All night long, your liver releases small amounts of glucose to keep your brain, your heart, and your nervous system alive while you sleep. And that's normal. That's supposed to happen. In an insulin-sensitive body, insulin acts like a gentle brake. As glucose rises, insulin signals the liver, okay, that's enough, you can slow down. But when visceral fat and liver fat build up, that message doesn't land. Fat inside the liver cells weakens insulin signal. The liver becomes insulin resistant, meaning it doesn't hear the cue to shut off glucose production. So it keeps releasing glucose all night long, even when your body doesn't need it. And that's what drives those stubborn high fasting numbers in the morning. And this isn't a theory. We've seen this play out very clearly in human controlled trials. One of the most important comes from a randomized overfeeding trial published in Diabetes. Researchers fed healthy adults the same exact number of calories, but from different types of fat. One group consumed calories primarily from saturated fat. The other group consumed the same calories, but from polyunsaturated fat. And here's what's fascinating. Both groups gained a similar amount of weight. Calories were matched. Nothing else changed. But the response was completely different. The saturated fat group rapidly accumulated fat inside the liver and more visceral fat around the organs. As liver fat increased, insulin became less effective at shutting down glucose production, especially overnight. The polyunsaturated fat group eating the same calories had minimal liver fat accumulation and maintained much better insulin sensitivity. So this tells us something incredibly important. It wasn't calories calories, it wasn't carbohydrates, and it wasn't body weight. It was visceral and liver fat that determined whether fasting blood sugar went up. And that's why cutting carbs often doesn't fix morning glucose. And it's why people can eat perfectly and still wake up with high blood sugar numbers. If you want fasting blood sugar to come down, the goal isn't restriction, it's removing the visceral and liver fat that's clogging insulin signaling, so insulin can do its job again. And once you understand that, the solution finally starts to make sense. So here's the 4-week visceral fat reduction playbook method. Number 1, lower saturated fat. That's the fastest way to unclog the liver. If you want visceral fat to come down, here's the first thing to focus on over the next 4 weeks. Lower saturated fat, not calories, not carbs, saturated fat. This is the fastest way to reduce liver fat, and when liver fat comes down, visceral fat follows. In practical terms, that means building most meals around beans and lentils, lean meats, whole grains like oats, quinoa, or brown rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes, fruit, large portions of vegetables, and dialing way back on foods that are highest in saturated fat: butter, cheese, cream, fatty cuts of meat, coconut, and palm oil. You don't have to eat less food. You don't have to count calories. You just shift what fills your plate. When saturated fat drops, the liver finally gets a break, and visceral fat becomes much easier to mobilize. You don't need perfection here. You just need meals that are higher in fiber and lower in saturated fat. That's the metabolic environment where visceral fat starts letting go. If you want free meal plans that show you this exact way of eating, comment guide below and I'll send it your way. So method number 2 was gentle time restricted eating, giving your liver the night off. The second lever has nothing to do with eating less food. It's about giving your liver a real break overnight. For the next 4 weeks, aim for a gentle time restricted eating window, not extremes. Here's what that looks like in real life. Finish dinner around 6:30 to 7 p.m. and then eat breakfast around 9 to 10 a.m. This gives you a 14 to 15 hour overnight window, which is already enough to see benefits. If that feels easy, you can gradually move toward a 16-8 schedule, meaning eating within an 8-hour window, for example, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., and fasting for the remaining 16 hours. But here's the key point. You don't need to jump straight to 16 hours. Even 14 hours is incredibly effective, especially if fasting has felt stressful or backfired for you in the past. Why this works has everything to do with insulin and visceral fat. When you're eating all day or late into the evening, insulin stays elevated. And when insulin is high, the liver stays in storage mode, holding on to fat and continuing to release glucose overnight. When insulin finally has time to come down, the signal changes. That's when the liver can switch from storing fat to burning fat. And this is where visceral fat responds. This isn't just theory. Clinical studies on earlier time restricted eating show improvements in insulin sensitivity, in fasting blood sugar, in blood pressure, even when people did not reduce calories. In this study, simply shifting the eating window earlier in the day improved metabolic markers without intentional weight loss or food restriction. What this tells us is important. It's not about discipline. It's not about willpower. It's about timing your food in a way that matches your circadian biology. Think of it this way. You're not doing a long fast. You're just letting your liver clock out at night so it can finally clean up stored fat instead of working overtime. Okay, method 3, zone 2 movement, the signal that tells visceral fat to let go. If you could only choose one type of exercise to target visceral fat, especially if the fat around the liver, this would be it. Not high intensity interval training, not punishment, not exhausting yourself, moderate, steady movement. This is what exercise physiologists call zone 2. And zone 2 movement is the intensity where you can breathe through your nose, you can hold a full conversation, your heart rate is elevated, but you're not gasping. Think brisk walking, cycling, swimming, elliptical, light incline walking. This matters because visceral fat responds best to consistent metabolic signals, not stress. Here's how to use this practically over the next 4 weeks. 30 to 45 minutes, 4 to 5 days per week. If that feels like too much, start with 20 minutes and build up. And if you do nothing else, add a 10 to 15 minute walk after dinner. That short walk alone can significantly reduce how much glucose your liver releases overnight. Now, here's why this works and why it's so powerful for visceral fat. In people with fatty liver disease, studies show that moderate intensity aerobic exercise reduces liver fat, improves insulin sensitivity, and lowers fasting glucose. And here's the part most people find surprising. These improvements happen even when body weight barely changes. In this study, participants followed a structured aerobic exercise program without extreme dieting. Liver fat decreased, insulin sensitivity improved, and metabolic markers got better before the scale moved in any significant way. That's critical for anyone who's frustrated by, I'm doing everything right, but the scale isn't changing. Because visceral fat is often the first fat to leave, even when total weight loss is slow. Mechanistically, this type of movement sends a very specific message to your body. We're using energy right now. Your muscles start pulling in glucose, your liver shifts away from storage, fat gets mobilized for burning instead of stockpiled. And visceral fat, which is highly metabolically active, responds quickly to that signal. This is also why over-intense exercise can backfire for some people. Too much stress raises cortisol. Higher cortisol tells visceral fat to hold on tighter. Zone 2 does the opposite. It lowers stress, improves insulin signaling, and creates the internal environment where visceral fat finally feels safe to let go. So if exercise has ever felt overwhelming or unsustainable, this is your permission slip. You don't need to go harder. You need to go steadier. Consistent, moderate movement, especially after meals, is one of the most reliable ways to shrink visceral fat and lower fasting blood sugar at the same time. Okay, method 4, fiber. Supportive, but context matters. This step is often misunderstood. So let's be precise. Fiber is not a magic switch that melts visceral fat on its own, but it plays an important supportive role when the overall metabolic environment is right. So in a 12-week randomized control trial in people with metabolic dysfunction and fatty liver, researchers compared 3 diets that were all matched for calories and body weight. A diet supplemented with monounsaturated fat, so primarily olive oil, a diet supplemented with additional fiber, and a habitual controlled diet. No one was told to lose weight, calories stayed the same, body weight stayed stable. Here's what happened. The group that increased monounsaturated fat saw a significant reduction in liver fat and improved how their liver responded to insulin. The fiber supplemented group did not show a significant reduction in liver fat over the 12-week period. That's an important distinction, and it tells us something critical about fiber. Fiber alone, added on top of an unchanged diet, may not be sufficient to rapidly reduce liver fat in the short term, but that does not mean fiber is unimportant. What the study highlights is that fiber works best as part of a broader metabolic shift, not as an isolated add-on. Here's why fiber still matters in a visceral fat reduction plan. Fiber displaces higher fat foods, especially saturated fat, when it replaces refined or fatty foods in meals. Fiber slows glucose absorption, reducing post-meal glucose stress on the liver. Fiber supports gut health, which influences inflammation and insulin signaling over time. And fiber lowers calorie density, making it easier to reduce liver fat without hunger when dietary fat is also lower. So the takeaway is not fiber doesn't work. The takeaway is fiber works when the overall diet stops overwhelming the liver with fat. That's why in practice, we don't just tell people to add fiber. We focus on fiber-rich foods replacing higher fat foods, especially saturated fat, because that's when fiber becomes metabolically effective. Practically speaking, this means aiming for roughly 25 to 38 grams of fiber per day from real food, coming from things like beans or lentils, whole grains like oats or barley, whole fruit instead of juice, and large quantities of vegetables. Not as a standalone trick, but as a part of a diet that allows the liver to finally respond to insulin. We've outlined this way of eating in our free guide, which includes 3 meal plans to choose from. Comment guide below and I will send it your way for free. So now you know that when fiber is paired with lower saturated fat, earlier eating, and consistent movement, visceral fat becomes much easier to mobilize, and blood sugar control improves as a downstream effect. That's how fiber fits into the bigger picture. And lastly, bone to support berberine. Now, food and movement are doing most of the work here, but there is one supportive tool I want to mention, especially if liver fat and stubborn belly fat have been part of your store, and that tool is berberine. Berberine isn't a stimulant. Berberine helps your liver work more efficiently at a time when it's been overloaded. A newer 2024 study helps explain this really clearly. So what researchers found is that berberine helps flip a switch inside your cells that tells the body stop storing fat and start using it. Specifically, berberine helps the liver become more insulin sensitive, store less incoming energy as fat, release less excess glucose overnight, and handle fuel feel more calmly and predictably. Why does that matter for you? Because when the liver is packed with fat, it stays in storage mode. It keeps releasing sugar into the blood, and visceral fat becomes very hard to budge. But improving how the liver processes energy, Berberine helps take the pressure off the system. Over time, that makes it easier for fasting blood sugar to come down, visceral fat to shrink, and insulin to do its job again. This is why Berberine is often helpful alongside the lifestyle changes we just talked about. It works in the background, supporting the same goal. Here's how to take it if you choose to. The dose that's been studied most consistently is 600 milligrams with meals twice a day, one with your first meal and one with your last meal. That gives you 1200 milligrams total per day, which is the amount used in the most research. This is also why the form matters. You want something that's properly dosed, third-party tested, and easy to take consistently. As a dietitian, this is exactly why we recommend Jade Supplements Pure Berberine. One capsule with breakfast and one with dinner. Simple and effective. And just to be clear, Berberine doesn't replace food, movement, or sleep. It supports them. Think of it as helping your liver finally exhale, so the changes you're already making can actually work. And as always, if you're on blood sugar medications, talk to your clinician first, because as insulin sensitivity improves, medication needs can change. Okay, let's put it all together. When you combine lower saturated fat, higher fiber intake, earlier dinners, consistent zone 2 movement, and targeted supplementation, visceral fat begins to shrink, often within weeks. As it does, liver glucose output drops, fasting blood sugar improves, insulin sensitivity increases, and energy becomes more stable. And if you want help turning this into real breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, comment guide below and we'll send you our free meal plans designed specifically to reduce insulin resistance and visceral fat. You don't need extreme diets, you don't need to fear carbohydrates, and you don't need to accept stubborn belly fat as inevitable. When visceral fat comes down, blood sugar follows. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and share it with anyone that can find it helpful as well. See you in the next one.